Hello, everybody. Thank you so much for tuning in today. This is the Bodega Cat Book Club Spiritual Edition, and today we're continuing our spiritual reading. I will not say the um, title of the book online because I might get into trouble with YouTube. But I will say this: the title of the book corresponds to a particular alphabet in the English alphabet. And if you take simple gematria, which is numerology, where A equals 1, B equals 2, C equals 3, so on and so forth until Z or Z, which equals 26, the title of this book corresponds to the 17th letter of the alphabet. I'll just say that. So for this particular book, whenever we come across that letter, I will say the numerical number instead of the alphabet. So, and I'm sure you guys are super, super smart. You guys can figure it out. But I will read the rest of the title. However, the title is called, the rest of the title is called The Earliest Gospel, or subtitle, I should say, right? Or subtitle. Okay, I think I'm getting it all mixed up here. So the rest of the title is called The Earliest Gospel. And then the subtitle is called An Introduction to the Original Stories and Sayings of Jesus. Okay. So the author is John S. Kloppenborg. So this particular book was inspired by spirit, if you will, or universe, or God, or whatever word you would like to use. I do have a little backstory about that, which I won't get into it here. But if you guys are interested or curious to know about the backstory, I went into a little bit of a detail in the introduction video of this book, which I will leave a link in the description box below, and you guys can check it out if you wish. Um, but it was a very interesting little story. But anyways, before we begin, if you like what we do here, please check out our other book clubs. We have our health book clubs on Wednesdays and then financial book clubs on Thursdays. And we put all our episodes on YouTube, all our book clubs on YouTube in a playlist. So you guys can download it or just hit play and listen to it that way. You could listen to it when, you're stuck in traffic, walking your dog, taking a walk, taking a jog, whatever it is that you do. We have other contents on there as well, not just the book club. So please do check it out, like and subscribe and comment. And I think they have a new feature now called Hype or something. I don't know. They're always coming up with new gimmicks. But, you do what you are familiar with or what you are, um, comfortable with. It's okay with me, you do you. That's all you can do. So please do check it out there and also check out our free monthly newsletter as well and subscribe to that also. And if you want to support us further, you can buy me a coffee, leave a donation. Also check out our merch. You can support us that way as well. We have many different merchandises for your fur babies, for your kitties and doggies, as well as for humans. And we are always updating our designs and coming up with new designs every month. So please do check it out and support us that way. And if you are in the Los Angeles area or visiting LA, come visit us in our healing center. We have a healing center that we use technologies based on Nikola Tesla's scalar wave research for holistic healing for both domestic cats and dogs and humans. So you can read all about that technology as well as our other services that we provide on our website. And come visit us if you're, around the area. We'd love to meet you. We'd love to get to know you, and we'd love to welcome you to our community. Okay, so this is chapter 2, part 3. Now, before we begin, I want to say this. I believe that um, spirituality or God or whatever word you'd like to give it is meant to be experienced It's meant to be transformative. It's meant to be life-changing. I don't think it's meant to be categorized, analyzed, philosophized, um, you know, put in boxes. I think God is too big to be put in our little boxes that our brain tries to do. So, just keep that in mind as we're reading this book. But, Spirit wants me to share it with you, to read it with you. So I am just following instructions in a way. Okay. So, okay, if you have a book, you can follow with us there. If not, you can follow with us here on camera, or you can just listen. Now, once in a while, they might have an end note. I won't read the end note at the back of the book. I will just mention it. And if you guys want to do a deeper dive or more research, you're welcome to do so. If you have the book, you can do that. But for the purposes of our reading for this, for our purposes, I'm just going to mention that there is an end note and leave it at that. Okay. Um, what else am I going to say? I think that's about it. So let's just dive in. Okay. The wording of 17. If we can arrive at a picture of a general contents of 17, can we get a clearer idea of its wording? For about one half of 17, the wording is already clear. Since Matthew and Luke agree verbatim on slightly more than 50% of their slip of the tongue there, of their 17 words. All right. There is an endnote about that. But there are, of course, disagreements. Can we decide which evangelists better preserved 17? Let me illustrate the process with a modern example. Imagine taking two different newspapers, both of which ran a story taken from the Associated Press wire service. If you line up the stories side by side, it is obvious that the basic structure and much of the wording of the two stories have been taken verbatim from the AP story. Oh, just a side note, wouldn't that be considered, what is that word? Uh, Gosh, there's a word that eludes me right now. But anyways, I'll probably come back. That word will probably come to me at 3 in the morning. Okay. Um, there may be, okay, sorry, got a little distracted there. The little squirrel sidetracked. Let us continue in the chapter. There may be some differences in wording and emphasis. There may be differences in length, but if you know enough about the editorial policies of the two newspapers and their readerships, you could make educated guesses as to which editor had intervened in the story, which editor had shortened or lengthened it, and which editor had made changes and why. Excuse me. A century of analysis of the Gospels has given scholars a good idea of the characteristic emphasis and Greek style of each of the synoptic writers. Matthew has a strong tendency to regard the activities of Jesus as fulfillment of text of the Hebrew Bible and to have Jesus quote the Hebrew Bible. He also likes the connective then, T-O-T-E, tot or tote, and the phrase kingdom of heavens, and to introduce speech with phrases such as, quote, and approaching, proselthon, X said, end quote. Mark famously punctuates healings and exorcisms with a command to keep silent, but also has a strong tendency to use and, kai, to join clauses and to overuse the word immediately, euthes. Luke stresses Jesus' piety and prayerfulness and favors compound verbs where Matthew and Mark have simple verbs. And there is an endnote about that. Let me take a famous difference. Plagiarism is the word I was thinking about in reference to the newspaper AP Associate editorial thing that the author talked about earlier, plagiarism. Okay, so another little squirrel. Today's going to be a squirrel day. Okay, let us continue in the chapter. Let me take a famous difference in wording between Matthew and Luke. In the first beatitude of Matthew's Sermon on the Mount and Luke's Sermon on the Plain, which comes from 17, Matthew has, quote, blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of the heavens. While Luke, end quote. While Luke has, quote, blessed are the poor, for yours is the kingdom of God, end quote. Of all the gospel writers, only Matthew uses the phrase, quote, kingdom of the heavens. This does not automatically mean that Luke's phrase is original. But when we observe that where Mark has, quote, kingdom of God, end quote, Matthew normally changed this to, quote, kingdom of the heavens, end quote. And that Luke retained Mark's phrase, it becomes more likely that 17 also had, quote, kingdom of God, end quote. And that, quote, kingdom of the heavens, end quote, is Matthew's editorializing. What of the other differences between Matthew's poor in spirit and Luke's poor? Poor in spirit is another way of saying humble. Thus, the difference between Matthew's version and Luke's is that Matthew is speaking about moral characteristics and Luke about social and economic states, which represents 17. The clue comes from the fact that Matthew has more beatitudes, 9 of them, and than Luke, which has 4, and that all 5 of Matthew's extra beatitudes concern moral characteristics: meekness, showing mercy, purity of heart, being a peacemaker, and willingness to be persecuted for the sake of justice. In the second beatitude, where Luke has blessed are those who are hungry, Matthew has a moralized version. Quote, blessed are those who hunger and thirst after justice, end quote. When we note the consistent way in which Matthew has moralized the Beatitudes and added 5 extra moralizing Beatitudes, it is reasonable to conclude that Matthew's poor in spirit is editorial. Luke is not uninterested in morality, as an examination of other parts of his gospel shows. On the contrary, Luke is especially interested in depicting Jesus as merciful and seeking justice. So it is quite unlikely that he would have deleted the moralizing Beatitudes had he seen them. The most probable conclusion then is that the original 17 Beatitude is, quote, blessed are you poor, for yours is the kingdom of God, end quote. Luke took this over more or less unchanged, and Matthew moralized and supplemented it with additional Beatitudes. For more than a century and a half, scholars have compared Matthew and Luke to determine the wording of 17 by the kind of process that I have just outlined, identifying where the two already agree, and in the cases of disagreements, deciding which evangelists altered the word of 17 by examining their editorial tendencies in general. This involves poring over hundreds of points of disagreements and deciding each case. Starting in 1985, a group of scholars began producing a collaborative reconstruction of 17, which collected the past 160 years of scholarship on 17 and decided which variant through an extended process of exhaustive data collection, debate, and editorial decision. The text of 17, published by the International 17 Project, IQP, in 2000, offers a reconstructed 17 of about 4,500 words or about 260 verses, accompanied by a full database containing all previous reconstructions and arguments made in regard to the reconstruction of 17 since 1838. And there is an endnote about that. How certain can we be about the wording and contents of 17? What of the possibility that both Matthew and Luke decided to alter the text of 17? The answer is, it depends. In some cases, we may have a high degree of certainty about some aspects of 17. In other cases, we're dealing only with general probabilities. The International 17 Project borrowed a grading system from the United Bible Society's Greek New Testament for ranking its decisions in Documenta 17 database. When Matthew and Luke are in agreement, the text of 17 seems certain, except in a very few cases where the agreement seems to be coincidental. When strong reasons can be supplied for concluding, for example, that Matthew's version is editorial, and when there is no reason at all to suppose that Luke has tampered with his version, and when the Lucan version is completely consistent with 17 style attested elsewhere, that reading is given an bracket A or bracket B ranking. In the critical edition and the English text of 17 printed in the appendix of this book, these readings are printed in normal Roman font. There are occasions, however, that either there are no strong reasons for doubting either Matthew or Luke, or where there are strong reasons for thinking that both are editorial. In these cases, Documenta 17 assigns a bracket C or a bracket D ranking, and the critical edition and English translations print the text in double square brackets. When there is a great deal of doubt about a correct reconstruction, Documenta 17 ranks the readings as bracket D. In the critical version, these texts are signaled by the presence of question marks, enclosing the verse number. In the English text, I have enclosed the translation in double angle brackets to provide a general sense of what may have been in 17, even though this is not a proper reconstruction. There are also points where Matthew and Luke appear to have edited 17 so completely that nothing is left of the original. But 17 must have had something. We cannot guess what it had. To summarize, ordinary font. Portions of 17 where either Matthew and Luke are in absolute agreement, or where strong arguments exist for deciding that either Matthew or Luke represent 17. Double bracket Jesus. Double brackets indicate where there is considerable uncertainty about a reconstruction. There are either good arguments for suspecting both Matthew's version and Luke's as editorial, or no particularly strong arguments to support either. The IQP prints the version that has a slightly better probability of representing 17. At that time, double angle brackets are used where the gist of the text is clear enough, but its precise wording is not. Ellipses indicate where it is impossible to reconstruct 17 at all. Angle brackets are used to signal an emendation in the text. For example, it is clear that 17's Beatitudes began with a blessing on the poor. 17 chapter 6 verse 20b. Sorry about that. I'm going to move that up. Let me read that let me read that paragraph again. For example, it is clear that 17's Beatitudes began with a blessing on the poor. 17, chapter 6, verse 20b. The Beatitudes appear to have been spoken to, quote, disciples, but it is not completely clear whether Matthew's, quote, opening his mouth or Luke's, quote, raising his eyes was in the introductory phrase. The IQP inclined toward Luke here, and thus prints, quote, and raising, that's double bracket, and raising his eyes to his disciples, he said. That's 17, chapter 60, verse 28. In the temptation story, both Matthew and Luke indicate that Jesus was fasting, but use different words to convey this. Because it is impossible to decide between Matthew and Luke, but it is clear that both conveyed the idea that Jesus was not eating. The IQP prints, quote, angle bracket, he ate nothing for 40 days. for 17, chapter 4, verse 2. There also must have been an initial transitional phrase between the temptation story, 17, chapter 4, verse 1 to 13, and the beginning of 17's sermon. But the wording of this transitional phrase is unknown because both Matthew and Luke have created their own editorial transitions. Hence, the IQP prints at the beginning of 17, chapter 6, verse 20, something was likely there in 17, but we cannot reconstruct it or even guess what it was. Oral or written. For much of the 20th century, 17 was simply assumed to be a written document. This is perhaps because scholars who studied the Gospels at 17 were themselves print-oriented and thought of early Christianity as a predominantly text-oriented movement. I don't think so. I think it's an oral movement. Sorry, just my little side note there. Let us continue. More recent scholarship has emphasized the fact that literacy rates in the ancient Mediterranean, including Jewish Palestine, were very low, between 3 and 10%. And there is an endnote about that. Scholars have also stressed that there was an oral, O-R-A-L, oral, A-U-R-A-L, scribal culture, where most communication was based not on reading, but on hearing. A small class of literate persons, the scribes, served to prepare written communication when needed. This fact does not necessarily require us to suppose that 17 was oral, O-R-A-L. On the contrary, we know that there were many documents in antiquity, and the small scribal class was responsible for the production of everything from economic and legal documents to literary texts. What it does imply, however, is that the majority of the population could access written text only through the oral, O-R-A-L, performance or recitation. Thus, whether 17 was a written text, as most scholars believe it to have been, or a set of oral traditions, O-R-A-L, oral traditions, most of what Jesus people knew the contents of 17 through its public or private recitation. Why would most scholars suppose that the material common to Matthew and Luke was written and not oral? The simple reason is that there are enough points where Matthew and Luke, in reproducing 17, are so strongly in agreement that we must suppose that they were looking at a written document. Or just a side note, they could have recited, I think, in the past, because this is just my assumption. I have no um, firsthand knowledge or evidence about this, but I'm just thinking that, people at that time are not very literate. And that's what my teacher said too. He said Jesus spoke in parables because most of the people that Jesus spoke to, the masses, were illiterate. And so I would imagine that whatever it is that they learn would be through oral recitation, oral history, things like that. But anyways, I digress. Let us continue. In fact, only 8 of 17's 92 pericope display less than 20% agreement, and more than 1/3 display between 60 and 98% agreement. And there is an endnote about that. This level of verbatim agreement is very difficult to explain except on the thesis that Matthew and Luke were copying a document. When you consider the fact that Matthew and Luke often relate multiple 17 units in the same relative sequence as was explained in the previous chapter, the conclusion is almost inescapable that they are using a written text, even those scholars who believe that some of 17 might really have been bits of oral tradition concede this point. And there is an endnote about that. As I have indicated above, there are also 17 passages where Matthew and Luke have a very low degree of agreement. Sayings such as the parables of the Great Supper, chapter 4, verse 16 to 24, that's 15%. The entrusted money, chapter 19, verses 12 to 27, that's 22%. And the admonition on forgiveness, chapter 17, verse 4, which is 6%. Should we conclude these from 17 and ascribe them to bits of oral tradition that have independently found their way into Matthew and Luke? What makes our decision difficult is the fact that ancient editors could be very inconsistent in their use of sources. We might think that Matthew would have been consistent in how much he was prepared to paraphrase his sources and how much he would use verbatim. But this would be a mistake. We have examples where we know both the source used by an author and that author's work and can therefore examine how consistently they copied. Analysis shows that one author might use the same source text in a highly inconsistent fashion, sometimes copying most of its words and at other times paraphrasing completely. And there is an endnote about that. Hence, when we observe Matthew or Luke sometimes copying 17 nearly exactly, and at other times departing from 17's words, or at least disagreeing with the other evangelists' rendition, they were only acting as other ancient writers did, exercising freedom at some points and copying exactly at other points. Additionally, we know of authors such as Josephus who regularly paraphrased his sources almost completely, with the result that there is virtually no verbatim agreement between his sources, the Greek version of the Bible, and his text. Yet, this is not a reason to doubt that he used the Bible. Such cases imply that it is not a legitimate inference that low agreement pericopes, such as the parable of the Great Supper or the entrusted money, cannot be ascribed to the written text of 17, but must come from oral tradition. Having said this, it is important to return to an earlier point and stress that despite the fact that 17 was a document that Matthew and Luke used alongside another document, Mark, for most of the Jesus people, 17 was an oral text, O-R-A-L, oral text, performed in various settings. I shall return to this point in the final chapter when discussing what happened to 17. All right, let us stop here for now. So I was saying earlier that I remember my teacher says that at the time when Jesus was doing his preaching and stuff, a lot of in many traditions you have the inner teachings, you have the outer teachings and the inner teachings. So the outer teaching, and you have that in every single religion, whether it's Christianity, Buddhism, Jewish tradition, whatever. You have the outer teaching and inner teaching. So the outer teachings, oh, my camera went off. Okay, anyways, I'm just gonna keep talking since we're at the end of the our episode here. Anyways, the outer teaching is for people who are not in the spiritual path, who might be illiterate, who are in the survival mode, putting bread on the table, doing the day-to-day activities that needed to survive, right? And then the inner teachings are more for people who are on the spiritual path, who are curious about spirituality or religion or whatever it is, and are a little bit more awakened and enlightened. And so you have those teachings for those people. So when Jesus was talking to or preaching to the masses, he speaks in stories and parables. And in a way, he has to really make it relate to them. I don't want to say dumb down. Make it relatable to wherever it is that they are in their spiritual path, which is for most, it's non-existent. And so the oral tradition is more important for these people. And recitation, reciting verses, reciting things are probably more of a priority than reading or writing or documents and things like that because they don't know how to read and write. So anyways, that's my little spiel, and I'm sorry about the camera. So we will see you next time in our next book club. In the meantime, I hope you guys all have a great day, great evening, great afternoon, wherever you guys are, and we'll see you again. Okay, bye now.